Podcast.
Welcome to Our Weird World. I'm your host, John Henson, and we are into the month of October, which means it is a month all dedicated to spooky Halloween topics like ghosts and monsters and aliens and demons, all that kind of stuff that we are going to cover every single week this month. And this week we are doing the third edition, third version of some ghost stories. Part 1 was back on episode 83. Part 2 was back on episode 186. And so I have 4 more quote unquote ghost stories. I'm sorry, I'm already doing it. All right, listen, I'm gonna get this out of the way right now. I have a real hard time, if you've listened to the Halloween themed episodes in the past, I have a really hard time of suspending disbelief because all of these stories rely mostly on just like one person being like, yeah, I saw it happen. And they're not believable at all. And then in other cases, you have just, if it is kind of corroborated by a group of people, it's typically, that group is just typically made up of people who just want to be part of something. They're just sad, lonely little people who just want to feel connected and part of something crazy that's happened. It's just all this hysteria. So I'm sorry if I ruin the stories for you this month with my extreme skepticism. I just can't get into it. All right. I am fascinated by these stories because it is, you know, there are people out there who believe it was real. And their folklore and stories that have been passed down by people who just swear on their life that it really happened this way. And God, I wish like we could prove the existence of supernatural energy or capabilities or whatever, because that would legitimately solve so many problems as it relates to, like, how did we get here? What happens when we die? This is a real weird and deep tangent that we're going on to start the show, but whatever, we're in it now. But like, you know, because the reality right now is that science, which is never wrong, science says that we're just another species of living being that exists on this planet. We have evolved to generate consciousness, which has allowed us, along with opposable thumbs, to create this entire infrastructure that exists, that no other animal or species has been able to accomplish. And then when we die, that's it. So you get one chance to live it to the fullest. And so many people just live horrible, just painful, suffering lives. And like, think about all of the people in Africa who, from the day they are born, live in suffering. And even the ones who are fortunate enough to make it to adulthood, they have kids who die constantly. All right, look, hang on. Let's not even make fun of Africa. All right. Africa gets a lot of junk for that. Think about just white people in America in like the 1600s and the 1700s. The white people living out on the frontier in the early 1800s. All right. And just how much they suffered and how miserable their lives were. And and science says that that's the only time that life gets lived. And that stream of consciousness that lived for 50, 30, 21 years, maybe 2 months in a lot of cases. That's it. And it started and then it stopped and that's it. And that's depressing. You mean to tell me that all of us lived in the same time that Donald Trump was a president, or that, that there was a pandemic, and there were people who lived, like, think about a person who lived at the same time that Hitler was doing Hitler things. And that was their one, like, shred of existence in this universe. Science says that that's what it was, and they ain't got nothing. No backsies, no do-overs, nothing. And that's it. And that's so depressing. Like, there's more to it than that, but I'm bastardizing this quite a bit. But back to the original premise of this entire rant. If we figured out that the supernatural existed, and there was hard proof that it existed, and we knew that, hey, guess what? Your consciousness and your physical body are fused together, but then when you die, they break apart, and your consciousness lives on. So you the person, and your personality, which some people need to work on that a little bit, but you and who you were and the memories you have, it carries on. And it just floats into the ether of the universe until it attaches itself to some other living being and does the whole thing over again. That would be fantastic. And that would give us all hope. It would probably also increase the suicide rate, because people are going to be like, I'm out. But it would just, God, would give so much peace to people. Now, we would probably then argue, well, Jesus is real. No, Allah is real. No, Hare Krishna, or whatever the Hindus believe is real. That would never go away. But it just sucks. Like, and again, this is that pessimistic, optimistic. We're not even going to do the episode, I don't think. This is just going to be the episode right here. No ghost stories. Now we'll get to them in a minute. But like, it's that pessimistic, optimistic. It's like, on one hand, you go like, oh my goodness, look at all of the bountiful blessings I've received in this one life. I need to make the most of it. And then there's the other side where it's like, God dang it, I only get one chance at this. And here I am, 35 years old, and I ain't done nothing with it yet. What a bummer. So all of that's to say that this week, just gonna transition back into the episode here. We have 4 stories of people who claim that ghosts are real and that they've seen them, and that there's evidence for their existence. And if these ghosts are real, then that would mean that when you die, maybe sometimes your consciousness stays around on Earth rather than floating off into space, and you just want to be a dick to people, or you just want to keep showing up. Maybe you're just real social kind of person in your present life, and then when you die, you just want to stay an extrovert and just kind of hang around people. Because I don't know why you would want to do that, but they do. Anyway, 4 stories. We have, oh boy, thank you for staying with me through that. We have the stories of the Little Red Man, not as racist as it sounds, James Briton Bailey, Frederick Federici, and our first story will be of Queen Esther. Story time. Story time. Story time? Story time. Queen Esther was an Iroquois elder who presided over a village of 500 natives in what would ultimately become New York State. One night in 1778, her son got into a fight with a drunk American woman and ended up dead, as so often happened in the early days of American history. And I guess it was already New York. I said what would become New York. It was already New York. Well, on September 27th, 1778, a devastated Esther ordered a nearby farm to be raided as revenge for the murder of her son. Well, the 2 unfortunate victims of this raid were Arthur and Jana Van Rossum, who were murdered and scalped in the way that natives typically did things back then. Well, When the American militia heard about these murders, they then rounded up a force of 200 men and sailed up the Susquehanna River to Esther's village to get revenge on the revenge of the thing that the Americans did to begin with. The Iroquois, however, they were prepared for this. And after several hours of fighting, the Americans finally got the upper hand and began their final assault on Esther's village. When Esther learned of the approaching American militia, she tried taking the women and children to the safety of the nearby Chemung River. However, the American forces led by Colonel Thomas Hartley quickly caught up to the fleeing Iroquois. And based on just kind of the geography of Susquehanna River, Chemung River, that's kind of up around near like Corning, kind of on the border, southern New York border, south central New York border between, New York and Pennsylvania, that area, if you cared. I don't know who does. But rather than taking the Iroquois prisoner, Hartley and his men then forced all of the women and children to line up on the banks of a nearby pond. Then, as Esther was forced to watch, the Americans staged a mass execution of her people. To make things worse, the Americans then dumped the bodies into the pond instead of allowing for a proper burial, which was something that was very important to the Iroquois and pretty much all Native Americans. But, of course, the Americans weren't done. Because how else are you going to become the best country in the world if you just stop at executing Native Americans and then dumping them into the pond? No. Esther, as the leader, was then taken to a nearby oak tree and lynched. She was then dismembered and tossed into the same pond with the rest of her dead villagers. Since then, obviously the pond where Esther and her people were massacred is said to be cursed, because of course it would be. Some historians claim that Esther placed a curse on any white settler who touched the land just before she was lynched, and then residents of a nearby community. What community is it? I don't know. It's probably somewhere in the area between like Sayre, Pennsylvania, Athens, Pennsylvania, and Waverly, New York. So just some random pond maybe in the woods out in that general direction. We don't know. Why would a ghost story dealing with something as important as clear evidence of the supernatural care to get the finer details and exact locations correct? It doesn't seem important. Anyway, so she placed a curse on any white settler who touched the land just before she was lynched, and residents of the nearby communities claimed to hear her screams emanating from the surrounding forest. Even more, people have claimed to witness a young girl crying and hanging from an oak tree, but then when they run to the woods to try to go help, she disappears. Hunters in the area have also experienced their own phenomena, saying that their weapons stop working after seeing this girl, which makes them believe that the apparition is Queen Esther herself trying to prevent more people from being killed. Sure. Our next story here is of the Little Red Man, and specifically the Moravians, who were a group of Protestants who formed in the Bohemia and Moravia regions of the Czech Republic in 1457. They followed the teachings of Jan Hus, who, like most Christian leaders in that time who challenged the Catholic Church's weird rules, was burned at the stake for heresy. His followers were severely persecuted for almost 300 years. And in 1722, with the help of Count Zinzendorf, the Moravians built the small village of Herrnhut on his estate in eastern Germany. And then just over a decade later, the first Moravians arrived in Savannah, Georgia, before moving north to Pennsylvania in 1740. Well, in 1753, a group of Moravians from Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, purchased about 100,000 acres of land in North Carolina from John Carteret, 2nd Earl of Granville, and built the village of Old Salem. Old Salem, then what would later become the city of Winston-Salem. The village, as well as other nearby Moravian settlements, was founded as a religious community, but quickly grew and blended into the culture of the other nearby heathen settlements. Well, on March 25th, 1786, a shoemaker named Andreas Kramer, who was popular among the locals, was working on a new foundation to expand the Brothers' House, which was this communal home for unmarried Moravian men. Suddenly, a huge chunk of earth collapsed onto him and buried him alive, killed him, obviously. The community was devastated at Kramer's sudden death, but as time went on, people started reporting that Kramer was still showing up. For years, people living in the brothers' house reported hearing sounds that resembled a shoemaker's hammer, and a small man wearing a red cap like the one Kramer wore was seen running through the halls. The little red man, as he came to be known, never really haunted or disturbed anyone, even as the building turned into a home for widows and then into a private residence. In one instance, a deaf girl named Little Betsy, the granddaughter of a widow who lived in the house, knew nothing about the story of the ghost, but excitedly told her grandmother she had spent hours playing with him in the garden. How she communicated this, I don't know. I'm sorry, that was tasteless. But you get it, right? Little deaf girl gonna tell her grandma she's playing with a little red man? I don't think so. Anyway, you get it. A minister was eventually called in to lay the ghost to rest, and then at that point, the little red man was never heard from again. Moving on now to James Briton Bailey, who was a pioneer born in North Carolina before moving to Kentucky with his young wife and 6 children. After his wife died, Bailey married her sister and had 5 more kids, which honestly, that happened a lot. And it was pretty easy, right? Like you marry a girl, she has some sisters, and you kind of, keep the family close. And then, maybe your wife dies giving birth, as did happen quite a bit. And it's just easy to be like, oh, hey, sis, come on in. Let's get married. Keep it going. You look enough like your sister. I'm not going to know the difference. I'll just pretend you're her. Well, I'm sure they didn't really appreciate that, but you get it. Like my wife has 2 sisters. If she died, I probably wouldn't marry them. Not there's anything wrong with them. Just I probably couldn't do it. And they're probably fine with that. I don't think they would want to marry me either. And I don't blame them. Anyway, back to the story. James Briton Bailey, he's got 11 kids now. He's got his sister wife, which is just wife sister, probably a wife sister, not a sister wife sister. Anyway, you get it. He served in the Kentucky House of Representatives, but was accused of forgery and then fled the state. Well, after serving in the War of 1812, Bailey and his family moved to Texas and settled on land that he had purchased from the Spanish government in the southeastern portion of the state near modern-day Houston. Well, after Mexico won its independence from Spain, the Mexican government then refused to recognize Bailey's claim to the land, despite him captaining the local militia and taking an oath to the Mexican Constitution of 1824. So basically, what has happened here is that Bailey moves down to Texas and he buys land from the Spanish government. But then Mexico got its independence from Spain, and Mexico comes in and is like, hey, Holmes, this is our land. I'm sure that's how they talked. And Bailey, he's like, no, fellas, I purchased this from Spain. It's my land. No, this is not Spanish land, Holmes. This is Mexican land. And then they kind of, got into a little argument. Bailey's like, yo, dog, I captained the local militia here. That serves you guys. I'm on your side. Why are you being dicks about it? Anyway, he quickly gained a reputation as being difficult to work with. He fought with everyone, even so much as looking at him funny, and was a constant problem for Stephen F. Austin, who was kind of the leader of Texas at this time. They were trying to make sure that Mexico stayed off their land. Well, those are kind of the only remaining details of Bailey's life before he ended up dying of cholera on December 6th, 1832. Well, according to his will, Bailey demanded that he be buried standing up and facing west, which seems like a lot of work for something that doesn't really have any apparent relevance. He also wanted his rifle and a jug of whiskey to be buried with him. His slaves, which he treated poorly, because of course they were, dug his grave and pointed him west, standing up like he requested, but they stole the whiskey. So today, a highway that runs through Bailey's Prairie, which is the area that Bailey owned and settled, that's the name of it now, connecting the towns of Angleton and West Columbia, is allegedly haunted by Bailey's ghost. The story goes that Bailey's ghost roams the area carrying a lantern looking for his jug of whiskey that was supposed to be buried with him. Sometimes he'll appear as a floating orb roughly 5 feet off the ground. Many people have claimed to see it, and some even think that the orb chased after them as they drove down the highway, or people just don't know what distant headlights look like. I don't know. That's that. our final story here is of Frederick Federici, who was an Italian opera singer who toured extensively throughout England for nearly a decade. He did a lot of opera things, or whatever. You don't really care about that. Federici's story doesn't really get interesting until after he moved to Australia in 1887. On March 3rd, 1888, Federici was playing the role of Mephistopheles in Charles Gounod's opera Faust. It was opening night at the Princess Theatre in Melbourne. He had just finished the final scene as he descended from the stage through a trap door. However, unbeknownst to everyone, he suffered a massive heart attack just as the show ended. Federici, the trap door, finally lands at the bottom, and he's just collapsed in a heap on the ground. He was rushed to the green room to a waiting doctor, but it was too late. He was dead, 37 years old. Meanwhile, the cast proceeded with the closing of the show and returned to the stage to take their final bows. No one had any idea what had happened, including the audience. And when the cast returned to the backstage area and were informed of Federici's death, they were very confused by that. Many cast members claimed that Federici had been standing with them on stage as they bowed. This would have been great if, cameras had existed back then that could take, a picture without you having to stay still for 3 hours, but it didn't happen. However, a lot of cast members were like, no, he was right there. He was right there standing with us on the stage. I'm sure you wanted to hear that accent again after a couple weeks ago. For years, after this incident, staff members at the theater then claimed to see a ghost dressed in 1880s evening attire. And out of respect, the theater kept a seat in the third row vacant for several years in honor of Federici. There you go. Part 3 of ghost stories in the books. I feel like I'm getting worse at storytelling. I feel like I stumbled over my words quite a bit there. Because here's the thing. All right. Having a kid really disrupts your schedule. I am now going several weeks in between recording episodes. I used to be able to record them every week on schedule. And I've said many times how far ahead I record, and it's for that reason, right? I just don't know when I'm able to record anymore. But now I just feel like I'm so out of practice. And so, sorry about that. Let's recap and see what we learned today.
What did we learn?
Number 1, if you're up in South Central New York on the border of Pennsylvania, go try and find a pond and see if you can conjure up the ghost of Queen Esther and see if you can just see a little girl getting hung from a tree, because that's not scarring at all. Number 2, James Briton Bailey apparently haunts a stretch of highway in southeastern Texas because he was a dick to the Mexicans and to the colonial Texas government. And maybe if you're driving down that highway, you'll see a little orb of light. And that's little Bailey's ghost looking for his whiskey. Or it's a car headlight off in the distance. Don't be an idiot. And then number 3, Frederick Federici died right after performing in a play. But several cast members swear he was up there taking the final bows with him. But he took his final bow just a little bit before. That's a dumb joke. I'm sorry. That was bad.
What did we learn?
Next week on Our Weird World, we continue our Halloween-themed episodes with the 5th edition of some monster stories. We'll have 5 pretty short stories about some more various alleged monsters. around the world. We are looking at Amphir Lothmore, the Borrego Sandman, the Mothman, always a classic, the Owlman, and the Michigan Dogman. So just come back next week and see if I'm better at this, which is a sad statement to say, because that's what I've got to promote you with. That's my hook. Okay, dude. Anyway, that's it. Keep it, do the stuff. Whatever I say. You get it.
This is a podcast